Welcome to part 7 of this YSL tutorial series on basic programming in Visual C#. In this part of the series we're going to focus on writing methods, which are one of the main fundamental building blocks of the C# language. We'll start by explaining why you want to create a method in the first place, with an emphasis on writing more organised, structured code. We'll then show you how you can write a simple method, and then how you can call that method from other code in a class. We'll explain how you can refactor your code automatically to save you a lot of time in the reorganization process, and then move on and explain how you can get methods to return values and how you make use of those values in your other code. We'll explain how you can then declare parameters in a method that allows you to pass arguments to those parameters to affect the way your methods work. And towards the end of the video we'll explain how you can create something called an overloaded method, which sounds very exciting, and finally how to create optional parameters which leave you with the choice as to whether or not to pass a value to them. So quite a lot to do. Let's get started. To get started in this tutorial, you'll need a copy of the project that we were working on in the last part of the series. If you don't already have a copy, I'll make a link available in the description below the video where you can download the starting project. If that's not there immediately, you can always go back to the previous video and download the completed project from there. Anyway, once you do have a copy of it, you can open the project up in the standard way by heading to the File menu in Visual Studio and either using the Recent Projects and Solutions link to choose a recent project you've been working on, or choose to open a project and then browse for it. So my project's sitting on my desktop. It's the WODA project, the YSL Dating Agency, so I can go into that folder and open up the solution file to open up the project. We can double click on the form then, the WODA application form, to open that up, and this is our starting point for this tutorial. So far in this project, all of the code that we've written has been stored inside methods that were generated for us automatically, and they've all essentially been event handling methods associated with the click events of the 3 buttons on our form. If we wanted to see the code stored behind any of these events, we can either double click on the button or right click on them and choose to view their code. And here's the event handling method for the click event of the Apply Now button. So far this has worked fairly neatly, there's been no problems with writing the code, but we are reaching the situation now where the method itself is getting quite long. There's pages and pages of code in this one single method, and this is going to make it more difficult to manage going forwards. So one of the reasons you might want to consider writing your own methods is to take a long procedure like this and break it down into its separate component parts. This makes reading the code much easier. It also makes managing and updating the code easier as well. It also makes the code reusable. So if we write a method that does one particular job, we can then plug that method in to various other methods to reuse the code. And that's what we're going to teach you how to do in this particular video. And we're going to start with an example that will help us to clear or reset our form. Now we already have one method that does that. It's the event handler for the click event of the clear form button. What I'd like to do is make it available, or make this code available in this event, to other methods in the form. So for instance, if we finish the application process and the user's seen their welcome message, we might want then to reset the form. And at this stage, in order to do that, I'd have to make a copy of all of this code and store it inside the click event of the Apply Now button. So instead, we'll write a method that stores all of this code in one single place, which we can then reuse in multiple other methods in the form. We can create our new method anywhere inside the class, and the class in this case of course is the WODA application form. Its signature, its definition, is listed towards the top of the page. Public partial class WODA application form. So we must create our new method anywhere inside the braces that begin immediately after the class's definition. I'm going to add my method down towards the bottom of the page, so I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and immediately after the event method that we have, the event handler for the click event of the quit button, I'm going to begin my own new method. Now you can optionally begin a method with whether it should be public or private. All of the items stored inside, all the current methods stored inside our class are private methods, which means they can only be accessed from within this form. So you wouldn't be able to write code in perhaps another class or another form that refers to these methods. And I think I'd like to do the same thing for now, at least, for our new method. So I'm going to start with the word private. This is actually optional. If you don't put in the word private, then by default, members you type into a class, methods you create in a class, will be private anyway. The other word you could use here, of course, would be public, which is the other word you may have seen already. So public would mean that the method would be available to items outside of this class, outside of this form. But as I say, I'd like to stick to private just for now. The next thing we're going to say is what type of data this method will return. And for this particular example, our method isn't going to return any sort of data at all. All it's going to do is perform a sequence of instructions and then immediately end. So the word that you use to indicate that the method doesn't return any sort of value is one that you may have already seen. It's the word void. So we're going to say private void. Following that, we need to type in a name for our method. So we need to think of something sensible and descriptive that helps to explain what the method does. I'm going to call my method reset application form. So we're using the same camel case convention that we've seen used previously. So we start with a lowercase r, because this is a private method, it will only exist within the class, and then each subsequent word begins with a capital letter. Immediately after the name, we need to at least open and close a set of parentheses or round brackets. If we were going to pass any information into this method, we could then list out the parameters for the method, but we're not going to do that in this particular example. It's going to be a very, very simple method. So that's the signature of our method. Immediately after that, we can open and close a set of braces or curly brackets, and then anything that we want our method to do, we can write out the instructions between these braces. Currently, nearly all of the code that I want this method to perform is stored in another method. So rather than write it all out again by hand, let's just cheat and cut and paste it. If I scroll back up the page to the click event for the clear form button method, I'm just going to select all of the code stored inside it and cut it. Control X, or I can right click and cut. And then if I head back down to my reset application form method, I can click into there and just paste the code in. Now there's one control that I didn't reset in the one of the previous videos. I didn't reset the date time picker back to today's date. So let's add another little bit of code here down at the bottom. We'll add a quick comment that says reset date of birth picker, or reset date of birth to today. And then we can write the code that does that. So we can refer to our date of birth picker control and refer to its value property and make that equal to datetime dot today. Semicolon at the end, and that's essentially all of the code that I'd like my method to perform. Now there is one optional extra line you can write at the end of a method. That's to write the keyword return followed by a semicolon. What the keyword return does is essentially ends the method. Now that would happen anyway immediately after this line. When the closed brace is encountered, that closes the method or ends the method, and it will return back to the previous point or the line immediately after the one which called the method in the first place. Some people prefer to add the return keyword in for clarity, for readability. I guess it's a style thing, I guess. It's entirely up to whether you do so. You just bear in mind that you do not need to explicitly say return. We will use the return keyword in a later method shortly in the video, but for this particular example, you don't need to do this. As I've written it in already, I'm going to leave it in place. All we need to do now is make use of our method somewhere else in our class. To use our method then, we need to call it from somewhere else in our code. So to do that, let's head back to the procedure or the method for the click event of the clear form button. And all we're going to do in here now, rather than have all those individual lines of code, we're going to have one single line of code which calls our reset application form method. And we do that by simply stating the name of the method. So reset application form. We'll see it appears in the IntelliSense list. Because it's a method, we need to open and close some parentheses after its name, regardless of whether we pass any information into it, and then a semicolon at the end, and that's a call to our method. We can do exactly the same thing then, and here's the beauty of writing a separate method. We can do exactly the same thing at the end of the click event for the apply button. So after we've displayed the message to the user, we might want to automatically reset the application form, and we can do that once again by saying reset application form, open and close parentheses, and a semicolon at the end. So that I can see my new method in action, I'm going to set a breakpoint on the line which begins the click event for the clear form button. So I'm going to click in the little grey bar to the left hand side to set a breakpoint, and then begin running my application by clicking the start button. When the form appears, I'll type in some basic details, so I can type in wise owl, and then I can choose a date or type in a date very quickly, choose a gender for me and a gender for my preferred partner, and then maybe change the values in these boxes, and quickly type something in there. And then what I'm going to do now is click the clear form button to reset everything. So when I do that, I'll find that I'm paused on the first line of the clear form button click method. And if I begin pressing the F11 key now, it will begin stepping through line by line each of the other instructions. So we'll reach the line which calls our reset application form method, and when I press F11 to do that, we'll find that we jump to the first instruction in that method. If I continue pressing F11 now, we'll see that we step through each individual line one by one in that method, and then eventually we'll either hit the return keyword, although bear in mind that I said that this was optional. When we hit return, it will automatically go to the close brace. Without the return keyword, that would have happened anyway. So it genuinely is optional. If I press F11 one more time to get to the close brace, that will then return to the next line in the procedure which called this one. So that's the click event of our clear form button, and there aren't actually any more lines of code in there. So essentially what would happen now is that this procedure would end. So I'm just going to click the continue button to get all the way through to the end of that one, and we should see that our form appears back on screen now, completely reset to its original values. So that's just proof that our method works as and when it should do. We could test it again, I suppose, using the apply button, but I think that's enough to demonstrate that when you write the name of a method in your code, that will call that one and run any code in there before returning back to that point in the method which called it. What we've just done here is described as refactoring code, which is basically just reorganizing things to make it easier to use and to read and to maintain. Now, although we've taken a fairly manual approach to doing this, we explicitly copied and pasted manually all the lines of code we wanted to generate, and we wrote out the name of our new method manually. We didn't have to do it that way. And in fact, to demonstrate that, what I'm going to do is reset things back to the way they were before. We might be able to get away with undoing most of this, but I'm just going to make sure that we can do this by manually editing out some of these lines of code. So I'm going to take away the reset application form line from my click event of the apply button. I'm going to delete it altogether from the clear form button click method. Then I'm going to take all of the code that we copied earlier and cut it from our reset application form method and then paste it back into where it originally was. And finally, I'm going to delete the reset application form method altogether by selecting and deleting it. Okay, so we're back to the same state now as if we hadn't generated that new method at all. The beautiful thing about this version of Visual Studio, and I think from Visual Studio 2010 perhaps even earlier, was the ability to automatically refactor code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the code inside the clear form button click method that I want to extract into a new method. Once I've selected it, I can right click on it and choose the option called refactor. There's two different things I can do here. The one that I'm going to choose is to extract all of this code into a new method. So if I do that, I'll be asked what I want to call this new method. So I'm going to call mine reset application form. And when I do that and click OK, you can see the little preview actually down here of the method that's about to be created for us. It's exactly what we wrote out manually earlier on. But if I click the OK button, we'll see that the code I just had selected gets replaced with a call to the reset application form method, and then somewhere else in my immediately below the original method is a new one, private void reset application form, and all of the code that we'd written has been put into there as well. The one thing that's missing, of course, is the return keyword, but as I say, that was an optional thing anyway, so we don't technically need that. All that remains is to uncomment the call to reset application form in the click event of the apply button as well. So if you don't want to have to manually write out all of your new methods, you can get Visual Studio to refactor your code for you automatically. Now that we've seen an example of a method which doesn't return a value, let's have a go at creating one which does. So if I scroll back up to the click event of our Apply Now button, somewhere in here is a very basic expression that generates a full name for our applicant. So it just simply concatenates the first name text with the last name text. And rather than write this expression into the main click event of that button, perhaps we'd like to call on that full name value multiple times in this class. So we're going to write a separate method which generates the full name of the applicant. In fact, one technique we could use to do this would involve writing a method which doesn't return a value at all. Because the full name variable is declared at the scope of the class, it's declared right at the very top, just within the class, it means that if any method changes its value, its change will be inherited by any other method which refers to it. So what we could just do is write a simple method which modifies the value of this variable. So let's start with that example. I'm going to scroll right down to the very bottom of my class, and I'm going to create another new private void, and I'm going to call this one set full name. and it's a method, so we need to open and close a set of parentheses, and then below that we need to open and close a set of braces, and in there we can write out a line of code which sets the value of the full name variable. So we can do that, in fact, by just copying and pasting, or in fact cutting and pasting from our main routine. So I'm going to find the full name equals first name textbox.text and a space and last name textbox.text. I can cut that out of that method altogether, and then scroll back down and paste that line of code in. All we need to do now is call this method somewhere within the click event of our Apply Now button. So if we scroll back up, and we might as well do this in exactly the same place as the line of code we just cut. So just after we've established that the first name and last name text boxes have been filled in, we can simply say set full name, open and close some parentheses, semicolon, and that will call on that method which stores the value in the public variable. Now this technique will work, and if we can just quickly see that, if I start the procedure, start the application, and type in, let's say, wise owl, and then choose a gender, male and female, and then click the Apply Now button, we'll see that we get the, oh, I'm too young. Oh, how nice of it. If I change my date of birth, so I was born in 1992, and then Apply Now, I'll see that the code has generated the full name, wise owl, with a space in the middle. So although the technique works, it is a little bit clunky. It's not particularly elegant code to do this particular sort of thing. What I prefer to do is write a method which returns the full name rather than just sets the value of a public variable. So what I'm going to do is remove this call to the set full name method altogether, and then I'm going to return to the definition of that method and modify it in some way. So first of all, rather than saying that this method doesn't return a value at all using the void keyword, I'm going to replace the word void with the string data type instead. So this is saying now that this method returns a value of a string type. At this point I'll get a squiggly red underline underneath the name of the method, and that's because although I've said that this method does return a value, I haven't said what value the method actually returns. So to do that, what I can do is replace this line here, where it says full name equals. We've seen the return keyword already. I'm going to use the return keyword now and say to actually return a value. So this function now will return the function. I've got a function, and technically it's a method. Some of the programming languages call methods which return a value a function. C# isn't one of them. So return, and take away the equal sign, of course, and this will now return the result of that expression. So it's a simple method which returns a very simple string value. What this means I can do now is remove my variable at the top of the class altogether. I don't need the full name variable anymore. So I'm going to remove this declaration altogether. I'm going to select and delete it. And instead, we can replace the call to that public variable in our click event. So it's built into the message text somewhere down here. So we should find it with a squiggly red underline at this point. So there we are. We're referring to a variable which no longer exists now. So what I can do is remove that altogether and replace it with a call to our method which returns a value. So it's called set full name. I think a more appropriate name might be get full name at this point. I need to open and close some parentheses because it's a method even though I'm not passing any values into it. So that's a way to refer to a method which returns a value. Now that we've removed our full name variable from the class, it's important to make sure that we've found every last reference to that variable which no longer exists. And a little clue here in the bar on the right hand side is this little red dot indicating there's some kind of error with my code at the moment. If I scroll down, we'll find that there's another squiggly red underline with a reference to the full name variable, so it's in the click event of the quit button. So I need to replace that reference to full name there with a call to the set full name method. Open and close some parentheses, and that will now return the full name to this second method as well. Now that I've changed the way my method works, I might think it's appropriate to change the method's name to reflect what it now does. So previously I called it set full name because it was assigning a value to a variable. What I'm now doing is returning a value from the method, so rather than set full name, I think get full name might be more appropriate. If I want to change the name of a method, I can, but I do have to be careful that every reference to that method gets updated as well. So to change the name of a method, nice and straightforward, just edit the name in its signature. When you do that, you'll probably spot some little squiggly red underlines, and you see another couple of red dots appear in my code indicating exactly where they are. I also get this little red underscore underneath the last letter of the method's name. If I hover the mouse over that, a little pop-up appears, and if I get the mouse over that and click on it, I get some nice options to allow me to rename every instance of setFullName to getFullName. So if I choose this option to rename this method, I'll see that the squiggly red underline disappears shortly, and the red dots disappear as well. So it makes it quite easy to rename things. It's still something to be careful of. Don't just go renaming things willy-nilly without thinking about the consequences, but always bear in mind you've got this little option to update every reference to a name that you've changed. We've seen that when we write methods, we have to open and close a set of parentheses after the method's name, but so far we haven't passed any values into those parentheses. So let's solve that now by writing a method which calculates the applicant's age. And to do that, we're going to pass in the applicant's date of birth. So we already have some code that calculates a rough age for our applicant somewhere up here. We've got age equals datetime.today.year minus dateofbirth.year. So we have a variable in this procedure which stores the date of birth of the user, and I'd like to pass that into a new method and calculate the user's age from it. So to start with, let's head back down to the bottom of the class and let's create a new method which I'm going to call, well, it's going to be a private method of course. The return type of this one is going to be an int, and the name of this one will be calculateAge. What I need to do now is define a parameter for this method, so I need to open the parentheses, and then I need to specify what the data type of any values I pass in to the method are going to be. So we're going to pass in a date of birth, and the type of that is a date time. So date time, date of birth. What I can then do, when I've spelt it correctly, is hit enter at the end of the line and open and close some braces, and then perform the calculation, which returns a value. Again, we get the squiggly red underline until we've actually said to what value we're going to return. I always think that's a little bit preemptive, but we just have to accept that it happens. So as soon as we've written the code that actually returns a value, that will disappear. We're going to use this method to calculate the user's age in a slightly more accurate way than we have done previously. If you remember in the previous routine, all we did was subtract the year of the user's date of birth from the year of today's date, and that gives us just the difference in years between those two dates. It doesn't take into account the day and the month that a user was born or what today's date actually is. So what we can do instead is write a slightly more long-winded sequence of statements or expressions that calculate the user's age more accurately. And I'm going to start with that same expression actually. I want to calculate the difference in years between their date of birth and today's date. I'm going to store the result in a variable which will be of the type int. I'm going to call it difference in years because that's pretty much what I'm calculating. And I'm going to make that equal to the year of today's date, so I can use the date time type for that, so I can say datetime.today.year minus, and I want to refer to the year property of the date of birth passed into this parameter. So when you want to refer to a parameter, then all you need to do is type in its name in your code. It's a little bit like having a variable declared in the signature of a method. So I can say date of birth dot year, semicolon at the end, and that will calculate the difference in years between those two dates. The next step is to calculate the birthday of the user in the current year. So I can do that and store the result in another variable which will be of a type datetime. So I say datetime, I'm going to say current birthday, and I'm going to make this equal to the result of a method of the date of birth parameter. So I can say date of birth dot add years. There's a method there that will add a number of years to a date, and then in a set of parentheses I can pass in how many years I would like to add. So you'll see that this method, or this parameter, accepts a value of an int data type, and we've got one there, difference in years, so that's exactly what I'm going to pass in, difference in years, and that will return the user's birthday in this year. The next step is to establish whether or not the user's birthday has happened in this year yet, and we can do that with an if statement. Essentially, if the user's birthday is yet to occur in this year, then the difference in years variable will hold a value that's 1 year older than the user actually is. So we're going to use an if statement, as we've talked about in the previous video in the series. So I'm going to say if, open some parentheses, and I'd like to ask if the current birthday is greater than today's date, and I can use that return that using the datetime.today property. And if that happens to be true, all I would like to do is subtract 1 from the difference in years variable. The simplest, quickest way to do that is to, at the end of this statement, say difference in years minus minus. So that decrements the variable by a value of 1. I could have also said a variety of other things as well. I could have said minus equals 1, which would have subtracted 1 from the difference in years. But the simplest, quickest, shortest way to do it is simply to say difference in years minus minus. Semicolon at the end to end that statement, and the final job, to clear this squiggly red underline, is to tell the function, or to tell the method, which value to return. So we can do that once again by using the return keyword, and this time I'm going to say return difference in years. And that should be enough to clear the squiggly red underline, and our method is now complete. Once again, all we need to do now is call this method within another one. So let's head back to the routine where we originally calculated the user's age with this basic expression. And what we're going to do is remove this simple expression and replace it with a call to our new method. So we're going to say that age equals calculate age, and then open some parentheses, and we must pass in a value of the date time type. Now, we already have the user's date of birth stored in a variable within this method. It's called DOB, which simply picks up on the value of our date of birth picker. So if we head back to that line of code, we can simply pass in a variable called DOB, and then a semicolon at the end, and that's a much more elegant way to calculate a user's age, not just in the fact that we're calculating it accurately, but it's a much simpler, shorter, easier to read piece of code. And we have this method available now for calculating the age in multiple other parts of the same class. We could do something similar now to replace the long if statement that calculates the user's age category. So we can take all this logic out and place it into another method. So let's create a new method down at the bottom of the class. This time the method, it will be private again, of course, so it only belongs to the class. This time it's going to return a string, and we're going to call it calculate age category. And we're going to pass in a single value to a single parameter again. So we're going to open some parentheses, and the parameter data type will be an int, and it will be called age, I suppose. Sounds like a sensible enough name. At the end of that, we can type in an open and close brace, and then write out the logic that returns a value. And all of the logic is actually already written for us. So what we're going to do is return back to the subroutine, or the procedure. Slipped into VB terminology there, subroutines. The method is what I meant to say. We're going to leave the first part of the if statement in place. This does something ever so slightly different. It validates the form. It doesn't calculate an age category. It's the other 3 conditions which do. So what I'm going to do is just select and cut those 3 conditions and statements using Control X, and then back down to the method we've just created, and we can paste in all the code. So what we need to do now is remove the else from the first statement. With we begin an if with the word if, of course, and then instead of saying age category equals, we're going to replace each of these with the word return. So we can return young, we can return middle age, and of course we can return old. At that point, all we need to do is call this method from within the main routine. So back up to the place that we've just removed all of this code from, and instead we can say age category equals calculate age category, and then in a set of parentheses we can pass in the value of our age variable. Notice that you can replicate the names of things, so you can declare a parameter for a method which has the same name as a variable in another method. That's absolutely fine. All we need to do is choose the correct item from our IntelliSense list. So we've got 2 items with the word age here. You'll see one has the colon symbol after its name. So if you want to refer to the variable, then make sure you use the one without the colon. The one with the colon is a reference to the parameter name. So if we wanted to pass in age, we can do this in one of 2 different ways. We can just say age, and that will pass in the value of the age variable in this method. We could also say age colon, so we can name our parameter and then say which value we want to pass in. So we could say age without the colon, and that would refer to the variable in this method. Naming parameters isn't absolutely essential, certainly not for a single parameter. You don't need to name them. So I'm going to take that little part away, and that will calculate the age category for each individual user. We should just give this one more quick simple test as well to make sure that this all works properly. So let's start the application and we can type in a couple of values into the form when it appears. So I can say wise owl and I'll choose an appropriate date this time. So I'm going to be born in 1992, I wish, and then choose the gender male, gender female, and then click the apply now button. So we can see that happily I'm still young at this point. My age is calculated as 21, and my name has been calculated as well, first name concatenated to the last name. So all of our methods are working happily. For the next example, we're going to do something a little bit more complicated. In the click event of the Apply Now button, we have a couple of different if statements that check whether two text boxes have been filled in. So we've got one check for the first name text box and another for the last name text box. If either of those two things contain an empty string, we change a couple of properties of the text box and an associated label, and then return from the method, so we end the method prematurely at that point. What I'd like to do is create a single method that I can call on for each individual text box that I want to validate. And into that method I'd like to pass in the text box object, or at least a reference to that object. I'll also need to pass in a reference to the label that's associated with that object. And I need that method to be able to return whether or not the validation has passed or not. I'll still need to be able to check in the main method here whether the validation has succeeded. So to do that, we're going to create a new method right down at the bottom of the class. It's going to be a little bit more complex than the ones we've created so far. To declare our method, then, this begins in essentially the same way as all of our other methods so far. We're going to say that it's private. The return type of this method is going to return either true or false. So the data type that returns true or false is bool if you're using the C# data types, or boolean if you're using the .NET data types. I'm using the C# data types, not least because it's shorter to type. So I'm going to say private bool, and then the name of the method, we're going to call this, or I'm going to call mine, check value filled in. And what I'd like to be able to do for the parameter list is pass in references to two different objects. If I open some parentheses, I'm going to declare the first parameter as a text box, and I'm going to call the parameter name text box, and then a comma. When you want to list more than one parameter, you must separate each one using a comma. And the next thing I'm going to pass in is going to be a label, and I'm just going to call this one label with a lowercase l. What I can then do is open and close the braces as normal, and then we can write out all of the code that will determine whether or not our validation has passed. Rather than writing out all the code again from scratch, we can once again copy and paste some code, or cut and paste some code. So let's scroll back up to the main method, and I'm going to pick on the if statement for the first name text box validation. So I'm going to take the entire thing, copy it, Control and C, then back down to our new method, and we'll paste it in, Control and V. What we need to do now is update the references to a specific text box. I want this method to work more generically. I'd like to be able to pass in any individual text box and have the method check that one. So what we need to do now is replace any reference to the first name text box with a reference to our generic parameter name, simply called text box. Now we could just manually type all that out, but that's boring and tedious. So let's do it this way instead. Let's select all the code that contains a reference to the first name text box. Then what we can do is press Ctrl H on the keyboard to display the Find Replace dialog box. What I want to do now is type in the value I want to replace, and the value I want to replace is first name text box. You'll see that that gets highlighted in the code in the background, which is lovely in this new edition of Visual Studio. So first name text box. What I want to replace it with is just a reference to my parameter called text box. So text box. If I then click the replace all button, which is this button here next to the replace box, if I click that button, I'll find that all the instances of the first name text box have been replaced quickly and easily. I need to do the same thing now for the first name label. So with the same text selected, what I'm going to do is search for first name label, and I need to replace all of those, although there's only two of them, with a reference to my parameter name called label as well. So if I click the replace all button, I'll find that those two instances get replaced, and that is a quick and simple way to update that code. What we need to do now is make sure that the method returns an appropriate value based on whether the text box was filled in or not. So we've got the if statement here that checks if the text box has an empty string in it. If that's true, I'd like to return the value false. So we're checking that the value is filled in, and that is false if the text is empty. So I'm going to return false for this part of the if statement. For the else statement then, what we can do is say return true. So if the text box was not empty, then the value is filled in. So we're going to return the value true for that. All we need to do now is use that method in our main procedure. So let's scroll back up to the method for the click of the Apply Now button, and we can remove. Let's start with the check for the first name text box. Let's remove that entire section of code altogether by selecting it and either backspacing or deleting it. What I'd like to do now is check what the return value of my method is. So I'm just going to say if, then open some parentheses, and I'm going to say check value filled in. So there's my method, and I need to pass in two parameters, or pass in values to two different parameters. The first item I pass in must be a reference to a text box. So the text box that I want to check is called first name text box. The second parameter, if I type in a comma, you'll see that I move to the second parameter in the tooltip. I need to pass in a label, and the label that I want to check is first name label. I then want to establish whether that returns false. If that returns false, I know that I need to exit the method at that point. I need to return prematurely. So one way to test if a value is false is to use the equality operator, equals equals, and then literally say false. So that's one rather simplistic way to do it. If that happens to be true, what I'm going to do, when I say true, I mean if the check value filled in is false. If that statement is true, then I need to return from this method. So I can do exactly the same thing now, wonderfully, to replace this entire if statement. So I can take this entire set of if statement and else statement out and replace that with another symbol if, check value filled in, open some parentheses, and this time I'm going to pass in the last name text box for the first parameter and the last name label for the second parameter. And I'm going to say if that is equal to false, what I want to do is return from this method. So you can see how much code we've saved, how much space we've saved in this single method now, the click event of our Apply Now button. Simply by creating that one single extra method, we've replaced tens of lines of code with these two simple statements. We should check now that the validation actually works. So we can do that by starting the application. So I can click the Start button, and when the form appears, I'll try to apply for the agency without entering a first name or a last name. So if I click Apply Now, you can see that that immediately triggers the validation for that text box. So if I type in a first name this time, but not a last name, and click Apply Now, I'll find that this one now passes its validation, but the next one fails. So I can type in owl, and then if I make sure I type in a valid date of birth and choose a gender for the partner and for me, and then click Apply Now, everything will now finally work. So that's one of the beauties of using or writing extra methods. You can take a whole host of complex logic that you would have to repeatedly type in and replace it with a single method that can be called multiple times. The other beauty of this is that if I decide later on to add more text boxes to my form, then I don't have to write another whole set of validation code because I've already got a method that will do it for me. I can just make another call to the check value filled in method, passing in another text box and another label to make it work. So we have a very useful method available now called checkValueFilledIn, which allows us to pass in any text box and have it validated. But what if we wanted a method that did the same thing for a different type of control? What if we wanted to check the value has been filled in, for example, for a combo box, like one of these drop-down lists, for the gender on the form? In order to make that work, we couldn't use the current method because its signature restricts us to only passing in a text box at the first parameter. What we could do instead is create what's called an overloaded method, and all that is a method that has exactly the same name as an existing one, but with a different signature, so with a different parameter list. So let's create one of those to allow us to pass in a combo box and have that validated in the same way. The simplest way to start here is just to copy the entire method that you've already created, so everything from its signature down to the corresponding close brace. Copy that, then give yourself a blank line or two and paste it in. What we can now do is change the signature so that the first parameter doesn't allow a text box, but instead it allows something called a combo box. So I'm going to type in a reference to the combo box class, and then I'm going to call the parameter, I might as well call it combo box to be consistent with my other method. Now what I need to do now, of course, is remove any reference to the text box and replace that with a reference to a combo box instead. So if I select all that text, and we can use the find replace method again, so I can press Ctrl H to bring up the find replace dialog, and I can type in what I want to find is the word text box, and what I want to replace it with is the word combo box. And if I click the Replace All button, that will replace 4 instances of that word. I can close down the Find Replace dialog. So now I have 2 methods with exactly the same name, but with different signatures. So let's see how that works in our main click event procedure. So after we've validated our text boxes, let's head back up and use our new method to check our combo boxes. We'll do exactly the same sort of check as we did previously, so we'll start with an if statement, and then in a set of parentheses we'll call on our check value filled in method. So if we look for our check value filled in method and then open some parentheses, what we should see is that the tooltip shows us that there are actually 2 different overloads of the same method. So the one that we have selected at the moment is the one that uses the combo box, and the second one is the one that uses the text box. It doesn't really matter which of the ones is displayed in the tooltip. This is worked out automatically based on the type of thing that you pass into the parameters. So even if I have the text box one selected, I can still choose to pass in a combo box. So one of the names of my combo box is called your gender list, so I can pass that in to the first parameter, and then the label is called your gender label, so I can pass that in the same way. I need to establish whether that returns false. I forgot to show you earlier on in the video, I showed you one way to test if something is false using the equivalent or the equivalency operator. What I can do instead is precede the name of the method with the exclamation mark symbol. So when you're testing Boolean values, if I just said if check value filled in, that's the equivalent of saying if check value filled in equals true. That's exactly the equivalent thing. If you want to say if it's equal to false, you can use the exclamation mark to say if not check value filled in, which is exactly the same as saying check value filled in equals false. It's the same result anyway. So on the next line, if that happens to be true, what I will say is return in the same way. And then we can do exactly the same thing for the other gender drop-down list. So I can say if, open some parentheses, not, check value filled in, open some more parentheses, I'll pass in their gender list to the first parameter, and I'll pass in their gender label to the second parameter. On the next line I'll say if that happens to be true, I will once again return from this method. So having written all of those validation checks, and much more simply and elegantly than writing out the complete if statement 4 times in this same method, what I can do finally is start my application and test that it all works. We've established that the first name and last name ones work, so let's type in first and last names quickly and easily, and then click the Apply Now button without filling in a gender. So if I click on the drop-down list to choose my gender, and then click Apply Now, find their gender fails as well, choose their gender, make sure I choose a valid date as well, so I'll be born in 1992, and then click Apply Now, and finally everything works again. The final quick thing we're going to show you in this video is a feature called optional parameters. So all of the methods that we've created so far, all of their parameters have been mandatory. We must pass a value into each parameter, otherwise the methods simply don't work. What we're going to do is we're going to make a modification to our age category method, the one that calculates whether the person is young, medium, middle-aged or old. What I'd like to be able to do for this method is I'd like to be able to pass in the threshold ages for middle-aged and old. So if we look at the definition of that method, we're currently just passing in the age of the person. What we're going to do is add 2 more parameters. So after int age, I'm going to type in a comma, and then I'm going to say int middle-age threshold, which is quite a long name. I wish I picked a shorter one. And then another comma, int old age threshold. So what I've done now is I've created 2 more mandatory parameters, and I'm going to use those to determine the if statements, the category that the user falls into. So I'm going to say if the age is less than, not the absolute value 30, but the value of the middle age threshold. And likewise, if the age is less than, not 55, but the old age threshold. What that means is that I need to pass in now two extra values to any call to the calculate age category. So I'll see I've got a little red dot there indicating there's some kind of problem. If I scroll up to that point, I'll find the problem is that I haven't passed in enough parameters. So it says there's no overload for the method calculate age category that takes one single argument. So what I could do is type in a comma here, and I could say that the middle age threshold is 30 and the old age threshold is 55. But I don't really want to do that. I'd like those to be the default values for that particular method, or those particular parameters. So scrolling back down again to the calculate age category, if I want to assign a default value to any parameter, what I can do is after its name, simply say what value it should have. So I'm going to say equals 30 for the middle age threshold, and then for the old age threshold, I'm going to say equals 55. You might have noticed just before I did that, if I take away the equals 55, you might have noticed the little squiggly red underline. There it is. So if you're defining optional parameters, the optional ones must always appear after any mandatory ones. So you can't have an optional parameter in the middle, followed by a mandatory one. So as long as I make this one optional as well, I'll see that the syntax is absolutely fine. So what this means I can do now is either pass in values to the middle age threshold or the old age threshold parameters or not. It's entirely up to me. If I scroll back up to the line which uses that or calls that method, I can take away the optional two parameters there, and this will still work happily. If I type in a comma, I'll see that these are indicated as optional parameters. You can see that the argument names or the parameter names are listed in square brackets inside the tooltip. This indicates that they're optional, and it also shows me what the default values of those are. If you've defined multiple optional parameters for a method, what if you wanted to pass in a value to some of them, but not others? With this example, we've got two separate optional parameters. If I wanted to pass a value into just the middle age threshold parameter, that's not too difficult at all. I can type in a comma and type in a value for the middle age threshold, and I can just ignore altogether the old age threshold one. What if I want to get to the old age threshold, though, and miss out the middle age threshold? Doing that is a little bit more tricky. Some programming languages allow you to skip arguments or skip parameters by typing in multiple commas to get to the one you want. You'll see if I type in multiple commas, it will jump in the tooltip. It will show me highlighted in bold the old age threshold parameter. So I could type in a number there. But if I click away from that line, we'll see that I get a little squiggly red underline indicating an issue. If I hover the mouse over it, it says there's an argument missing, so I can't just leave that empty. The trick here is to use named parameters. So we saw that briefly very early on in the video. If I take away the commas for this and type in a comma again, rather than going to the middle age threshold parameter, I can actually say old age threshold. And you'll see this appears in the tooltip with a colon after its name. So if I say old age threshold and then make that equal to, say, 60, I can happily miss out the middle age threshold parameter and not run into any issues. Personally, if I'm going to name one parameter, I would prefer to name all of them, so I'd actually also name my age parameter here as well. So I would have, in front of the word age, I would have the name of the parameter, which is also called age. So age followed by a colon to specify that parameter is being passed in, or that argument is being passed into the age parameter, and that argument is being passed into the old age threshold parameter. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseR website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.